Have you ever looked at someone you've trusted for decades and realized that a single moment had changed everything? What would you do if your husband grabbed a letter from your hands before you could read it, destroyed it in front of your entire family, and then acted as though nothing had happened? Would you believe his explanation? Or would you spend the rest of the day wondering what he was so desperate to hide? Until that Saturday afternoon, I never imagined I'd have to answer those questions myself. My husband and I had been married for 32 years. We had raised 2 wonderful children, welcomed 3 energetic grandchildren into our lives, and built what I believed was a marriage founded on honesty. In all those years, I'd never seen him lose his temper. He wasn't the kind of man who shouted or acted without thinking. If anything, people often came to him because he stayed calm when everyone else was falling apart. If someone had asked me who I trusted most in the world, I would have answered his name without a second thought. That's why what happened at our daughter's baby shower didn't just surprise me. It frightened me. The afternoon was simple, exactly the kind of family gathering I'd always loved. Our daughter had organized everything in her backyard, insisting that I wasn't allowed to help because I was the guest of honor. My husband spent most of his time playing with our youngest grandson, helping him fold paper airplanes that refused to fly in a straight line. Every failed attempt made the little boy laugh harder, and my husband laughed right along with him. Watching the 2 of them together, I remember thinking how grateful I was that our family had stayed so close over the years. Then the doorbell rang. Since everyone else was outside, I walked through the house and opened the front door. A delivery driver stood on the porch holding a single cream-colored envelope. It wasn't decorated like a birthday card or bulky like a package. It was elegant, unusually thick, and sealed with a beautiful gold emblem pressed into the back flap. My name was written across the front in neat handwriting I didn't recognize. "There you go, ma'am," the driver said before heading back to his van. I turned the envelope over, searching for a return address. There wasn't one. Curious, I carried it back toward the backyard. Before I'd even reached the patio, my sister noticed it. "Well, that looks important." I smiled. "I just hope it's not another hospital bill." A few people chuckled. My daughter joked that maybe someone had finally remembered how to write a proper letter instead of sending everything by email. For one ordinary moment, it was nothing more than a harmless piece of mail. Then I looked at my husband. His smile disappeared. Not gradually. Instantly. From the other side of the yard, his eyes had locked onto the gold seal. The color drained from his face so quickly that it startled me. His shoulders stiffened. His breathing changed. It wasn't confusion I saw. It was recognition. Not of the envelope itself. Of whoever had sent it. Before I could ask if something was wrong, he hurried across the patio so fast that our youngest grandson had to jump out of his way. "Grandpa?" the little boy asked, blinking in surprise. My husband didn't even seem to hear him. He reached me, snatched the envelope from my hands, and tore it straight down the middle. I gasped. Then he tore it again. And again. Cream-colored pieces drifted through the warm afternoon air, settling across the patio like fallen leaves. The laughter vanished. My daughter lowered the tray she was carrying. My son-in-law stared in complete disbelief. Even the grandchildren stopped talking, sensing something had happened that the adults couldn't explain. Our grandson looked up at him with innocent confusion. "Grandpa, why are you angry?" For a heartbeat, no one spoke. My husband stood frozen, gripping the torn pieces so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. One small scrap clung to his fingers, and I noticed they were trembling. He swallowed hard before forcing a smile that never reached his eyes. It's probably one of those fake legal notices," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "You hear about them all the time. They scare older homeowners into calling fake lawyers. I wasn't going to let anyone get upset over something that belonged in the trash." No one challenged him. But no one looked convinced either. My daughter exchanged a quick glance with her husband. My sister frowned slightly, as though she wanted to ask another question, but decided against it. The silence became so uncomfortable that my son-in-law finally cleared his throat and suggested we take the family photo before the cake melted in the afternoon sun. People slowly began talking again. At least they pretended to. I couldn't. After 32 years of marriage, I knew the difference between concern and fear. Concern makes people explain. Fear makes them react. And what I just witnessed wasn't the behavior of a husband trying to protect his family. It was the behavior of someone terrified that a single letter might reveal something he'd spent years trying to keep buried. As everyone drifted back into awkward conversations, I knelt to gather the torn pieces scattered around my feet. Most of them were too small to make out. One had landed beneath the edge of a flower pot. Just as I reached for it, I looked across the yard. My husband wasn't watching our daughter. He wasn't watching the grandchildren. He wasn't even worried about what the rest of the family thought. He was watching my hands. And the fear in his eyes told me one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever had been inside that envelope, he believed even one surviving piece could destroy everything. For the rest of the afternoon, everyone did their best to pretend the celebration hadn't been interrupted. But pretending isn't the same as forgetting. The conversations eventually returned, though they never sounded as relaxed as they had before. Every laugh seemed just a little forced. Every smile lingered a second too long. Even the grandchildren sensed something had shifted. Our youngest grandson stayed close to his mother for the rest of the party, occasionally glancing toward my husband with the same puzzled expression he'd worn when he asked why Grandpa was angry. That simple question echoed in my mind more than anything else. As we gathered for the family photograph, my husband slipped his arm around my shoulders like he always did. Anyone looking at that picture would see a happy couple surrounded by children and grandchildren. They'd never know that, just minutes earlier, I'd seen a look on his face I'd never witnessed in 32 years of marriage. When the celebration ended, everyone hugged goodbye. My daughter held on to me just a little longer than usual. "Mom," she whispered, making sure her father couldn't hear. "Is everything okay?" I smiled automatically. Of course. The lie surprised even me, because I wasn't trying to convince her. I was trying to convince myself. The drive home was painfully quiet. Normally we'd talk about the grandchildren, laugh about something funny that had happened, or argue over who was taking home the leftover pie. Instead, the only sound was the steady rhythm of the tires rolling across the highway. Twice I caught him glancing in my direction. Twice he looked away before I could meet his eyes. Finally, he broke the silence. "I hope I didn't ruin the party." His voice sounded calm. Too calm. "You didn't ruin it," I answered softly. "You frightened everyone." He tightened his grip on the steering wheel. I stopped breathing. I turned the photograph over. Someone had written the names of everyone in the picture. There was no mistake. It really was my father. I sat there on the hallway floor staring at it, trying to make sense of something that shouldn't have existed. My husband had always told me he'd met my father for the first time the evening he came to ask for permission to marry me. I'd heard that story dozens of times over the years. Our children had heard it. Our grandchildren probably would have one day. So why was there a photograph proving they'd known each other years earlier? For several minutes, I convinced myself there had to be a simple explanation. Maybe my husband had forgotten. Maybe he'd mixed up the timeline. Maybe I was making too much of an old photograph. Then I remembered something my mother used to say. People rarely forget how they met someone who changed their life. The photograph wasn't proof of betrayal, but it was proof of a lie. And once I'd accepted that, I couldn't pretend everything else hadn't happened. I wanted answers. Not accusations. Answers. That afternoon, I drove to the local library. It wasn't as strange as it sounds. Our town kept old business directories and newspaper archives, and I suddenly found myself wondering where that photograph had been taken. I didn't even know the name of the company. After nearly 2 hours of searching, I found nothing. I left feeling embarrassed. Maybe I really had allowed one strange afternoon to cloud 32 years of marriage. As I walked across the parking lot, I almost threw the photograph into the nearest trash can. Instead, I slipped it back into my purse. On the drive home, my phone rang. It was my older brother. We hadn't spoken in a few weeks. After a few minutes of ordinary conversation, he said something that caught me completely off guard. "Do you remember Dad's old friend Harold?" I frowned. No, should I? To trust him. To let it go. 32 years of marriage deserved better than suspicion born from a single afternoon. I even promised myself that if nothing else happened, I'd never bring it up again. I wanted my marriage back more than I wanted answers. Just before sunrise, I heard the front door open. At first, I assumed I was imagining things. My husband had been retired for 3 years. He never woke before me. Curious, I quietly walked to the front window. He was standing beside the outdoor trash bin. The lid was open. Carefully, almost methodically, he was removing handfuls of shredded paper from a smaller kitchen garbage bag. The torn envelope. He hadn't thrown it away after all. He'd brought it home. I watched as he emptied every last piece into a heavy black contractor bag. Then he tied the bag tightly. He looked up and down the street. Not casually. Carefully. As if making sure no one was watching. A knot formed in my stomach. Even then, I fought against the thought that kept trying to take hold. Maybe he simply wanted to make sure no one could use our address. Maybe he was being overly cautious. Maybe there really was an innocent explanation. I clung to those possibilities because the alternative was almost impossible to face. Then he carried the bag to the trunk of his car. A few seconds later, he drove away. Not to the grocery store. Not to breakfast with friends. Not anywhere he normally went. He simply disappeared with the only remaining pieces of that envelope. I stood there for several minutes after his car turned the corner. Part of me wanted to make another cup of coffee, go back upstairs, and pretend I'd never looked out that window. If I did that, maybe life would return to normal. Maybe I could keep believing the man I'd loved for more than 3 decades had nothing to hide. But another part of me knew something had already changed. Not because I'd found proof. Because I'd started asking questions I never thought I'd have to ask. Later that afternoon, I drove back to my daughter's house. I told her I'd accidentally taken home one of her serving bowls. That wasn't a complete lie. The bowl was sitting on the passenger seat. But it wasn't the reason I'd gone back. After everyone had gone inside, I quietly walked toward the flower beds beside the patio. The wind had scattered most of the tiny paper fragments. The rest had been swept away. I almost turned back. Then something caught my eye beneath the edge of a wooden planter. A tiny cream-colored scrap. No bigger than my thumbnail. My heart began to pound. I picked it up carefully. Only 4 words had survived. Finally tell her. I stared at that tiny fragment until the words began to blur. Someone hadn't gone to all that effort to send a fake legal notice. Someone had been trying to tell me something. And for the first time since all of this began, I realized I was no longer trying to understand the envelope. I was trying to understand the man I'd spent 32 years believing I knew better than anyone else. I slipped the tiny paper fragment into my purse and drove home more slowly than usual. The whole way back, I kept telling myself the same thing. Don't jump to conclusions. For words weren't a confession. They weren't proof. They were simply 4 words on a torn piece of paper. Surely there had to be another explanation. By the time I pulled into the driveway, I'd almost convinced myself to stop looking any further. Almost. My husband was in the backyard trimming the rose bushes, humming softly to himself as though it had been the most ordinary day of his life. He smiled when he saw me. Did you get the bowl back to our daughter? I did. Everything all right? For a moment, I almost told him. I almost pulled the paper from my purse, handed it to him and said, please, just tell me the truth. I wanted him to give me a reason to stop doubting him. Instead, I smiled. Everything's fine. The words tasted like a lie. That evening, we sat together watching television, but neither of us seemed to know what was on the screen. The silence between us felt different now. Not angry. Careful. As if we were both avoiding a conversation neither of us was ready to have. The next morning, after he left to meet an old golfing friend for breakfast, I made a decision that filled me with guilt. I was going to look through the boxes we'd kept in the hall closet. Not because I expected to find some dramatic secret. Because I was searching for something that would prove I was wrong. Old tax returns. Vacation photographs. Birthday cards. Anything that reminded me my husband was exactly who I'd always believed he was. For nearly an hour, that's all I found. Then tucked inside an old photo album, something slipped onto the floor. It was a faded photograph. 4 men stood outside an office building, smiling at the camera. At first, I almost put it back. Then I looked more closely. One of the men was my husband. Another, Was my father. I stopped breathing. I turned the photograph over. Someone had written the names of everyone in the picture. There was no mistake. It really was my father. I sat there on the hallway floor staring at it, trying to make sense of something that shouldn't have existed. My husband had always told me he'd met my father for the first time the evening he came to ask for permission to marry me. I'd heard that story dozens of times over the years. Our children had heard it. Our grandchildren probably would have one day. So why was there a photograph proving they'd known each other years earlier? For several minutes, I convinced myself there had to be a simple explanation. Maybe my husband had forgotten. Maybe he'd mixed up the timeline. Maybe I was making too much of an old photograph. Then I remembered something my mother used to say. People rarely forget how they met someone who changed their life. The photograph wasn't proof of betrayal, but it was proof of a lie. And once I'd accepted that, I couldn't pretend everything else hadn't happened. I wanted answers. Not accusations. Answers. That afternoon, I drove to the local library. It wasn't as strange as it sounds. Our town kept old business directories and newspaper archives, and I suddenly found myself wondering where that photograph had been taken. I didn't even know the name of the company. After nearly 2 hours of searching, I found nothing. I left feeling embarrassed. Maybe I really had allowed one strange afternoon to cloud 32 years of marriage. As I walked across the parking lot, I almost threw the photograph into the nearest trash can. Instead, I slipped it back into my purse. On the drive home, my phone rang. It was my older brother. We hadn't spoken in a few weeks. After a few minutes of ordinary conversation, he said something that caught me completely off guard. "Do you remember Dad's old friend Harold?" I frowned. No, should I? "He wasn't exactly a friend," my brother replied. "Dad mentioned him a few times near the end of his life. Said Harold was the only person who knew what really happened at that company." I gripped the steering wheel. "What company?" There was a brief silence. "I don't remember the name." "Why? Did something happen?" I looked at the photograph resting on the passenger seat. "No, primelit. I was just thinking about Dad." After we hung up, I pulled into the first empty parking lot I could find. My heart was racing. Harold. It was the first new name connected to all of this. Not an anonymous sender. Not a mystery. A real person. When I got home, I searched through one of my father's old address books that I'd kept after he passed away. Most of the phone numbers were no longer in service. But beside one name, Harold Bennett, there was an address, crossed out. And beneath it, written in my father's handwriting, "Moved to Maple Grove Retirement Community." I stared at those words for a long time. The envelope had started this story. The photograph had changed it. But now, for the first time, I had somewhere to go. And if Harold was still alive, he might be the only person left who knew why my husband had been so terrified of that gold envelope. The next morning, I sat in my car outside Maple Grove Retirement Community for nearly 10 minutes. Twice, I reached for the door handle. Twice I let go. I still hadn't accepted that my husband had done anything wrong. In fact, I kept hoping Harold would tell me I'd misunderstood everything. That the photograph had an innocent explanation. That the envelope had been meant for someone else. That I'd spent the last few days imagining a mystery that didn't exist. I wanted my marriage back far more than I wanted answers. Finally, I walked inside. The receptionist greeted me with a warm smile. "I'm looking for Harold Bennett." Her smile faded ever so slightly. "I'm sorry," she said gently. "Mr. Bennett passed away about 3 weeks ago." For a moment I couldn't speak. I had arrived too late. I thanked her anyway and turned toward the exit, feeling foolish for believing I'd find the answers so easily. "Excuse me." I turned around. The receptionist hesitated. "Were you expecting to see him because of a letter?" Every muscle in my body tightened. "What did you say?" She lowered her voice. "Please have a seat." A few minutes later, an elderly woman joined us. She introduced herself as Eleanor, one of the volunteers who had spent years helping Harold after his eyesight began to fail. She studied my face for a long moment before speaking. "I've been wondering if you'd ever come." "You knew I was coming?" She shook her head. "No. Harold hoped you would. For the next hour, Eleanor didn't begin by handing me evidence. She began by telling me about Harold. He and my father had worked together for years. According to Eleanor, Harold talked about my father often. He used to say your father was the most honest man he'd ever met. She smiled sadly. And he also used to say honesty can become very expensive when dishonest people are afraid. I listened without interrupting. Why didn't Harold contact me years ago? I finally asked. Eleanor sighed. He tried. My heart skipped. He wrote letters. Several. He even drove to your house once. What happened? He lost his nerve. She smiled sadly. He was afraid you'd think he was a bitter old man trying to destroy a happy marriage. Suddenly Harold wasn't just a mysterious name. He was a man who had carried guilt almost as long as my husband had carried his secret. Eleanor stood and disappeared into another room. When she returned, she wasn't carrying a notebook. She was carrying a small cardboard box. He asked us not to give this to anyone unless they came looking for it. She placed it on the table between us. Inside were old photographs, company newsletters, meeting agendas, holiday cards, the ordinary pieces of people's working lives. Not dramatic evidence, real memories. As we sorted through them together, the story began revealing itself one piece at a time. One photograph showed my father and my husband standing side by side at a company picnic nearly 2 years before my husband and I met. Another showed Harold sitting beside them during a retirement dinner. There was no denying it anymore. My husband hadn't simply known my father. They had been colleagues, friends, maybe more. Then Eleanor unfolded a yellowing newspaper clipping. It reported that a local manufacturing company had suddenly closed after an internal financial investigation. No names were mentioned. Just the company, the date, and one sentence. A senior employee accepted responsibility for irregular accounting practices. Eleanor quietly looked at me. My father. She slowly shook her head. No. Someone else. I frowned. But, I thought. I know what you're thinking. She leaned forward. Harold spent years trying to understand what happened. He eventually learned the man who accepted responsibility wasn't the person who started the fraud. My stomach tightened. So who did? I don't know. It wasn't the answer I expected. For the first time since this all began, someone admitted they didn't know. And strangely, that made me trust her even more. She reached into the bottom of the box and carefully lifted out a worn leather notebook. This, she said quietly, is all Harold could piece together after everyone else moved on. She didn't hand it to me immediately. Instead, she opened it herself. The first pages weren't accusations. They were diary entries. Harold had written about sleepless nights, about trying to convince himself to come forward, about watching an innocent family carry a burden that wasn't theirs. One entry caught my attention. I asked him 3 times to tell her the truth himself. 3 times he promised he would. I looked up. Him. Eleanor nodded. Your husband. The room suddenly felt smaller. My husband hadn't spent 32 years hiding the truth from me, because he'd forgotten. He had been given chance after chance to tell me himself. And every single time, he chose silence. Eleanor finally placed the notebook in my hands. I think you're ready now. I looked down at the next page. It wasn't a diary entry. It was a list of names. My husband's name. My father's name. Harold's name. And beside each one, a handwritten note explaining the role they had played in a decision that had changed all of their lives forever. I drove home with Harold's notebook resting on the passenger seat. More than once I reached over, intending to open it again. Each time, I pulled my hand back. For 4 days I'd been searching for answers. Now that I finally had them, I wasn't sure I was ready to live with them. When I walked through the front door, my husband was sitting alone in the living room. The television was on, but the volume was muted. It didn't look as though he'd been watching it. It looked as though he'd been waiting. You were gone a long time, he said quietly. I know. His eyes dropped to the notebook in my hands. Everything changed. I watched the recognition spread across his face. Not surprise. Recognition. Almost immediately, his shoulders sagged, as though he had been carrying a weight for years, and suddenly realized he couldn't hold it any longer. He didn't ask where I'd found it. He already knew. Neither of us spoke for what felt like forever. Finally, I placed the notebook on the coffee table between us. I met someone who knew Harold. He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were filled with something I'd never seen before. Not fear. Defeat. I always hoped. He whispered. Then he stopped. What? I hoped he'd hate me enough to throw it away. Those words hurt more than I expected. Not because they explained anything. Because they proved he'd known this day might come. I sat across from him. For the first time in 32 years, I didn't know who the man in front of me really was. I need you to tell me something. He nodded silently. Did you know my father before you met me? Yes. There was no hesitation. No excuse. No attempt to soften the truth. Just one quiet word. Yes. I felt something inside me break. Not because of the answer. Because he'd been able to tell the truth so easily now. After spending 3 decades hiding it. You lied to me. I did. You let me tell our children that story. I know. You stood beside me at my father's funeral. His head dropped. I know. Each answer became quieter. Each one sounded heavier than the last. I opened Harold's notebook. I read what he wrote. My husband covered his face with both hands. He asked you 3 different times to tell me. No response. He believed you would eventually do the right thing. Still nothing. I closed the notebook. So why didn't you? For a long time, all I could hear was the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Then, in a voice that barely rose above a whisper, he answered. Because every year that passed made it harder. He looked up at me, his eyes red with tears. The first year, I was ashamed. The 5th year, I was terrified. By the 20th year, he stopped. I convinced myself that telling you would only destroy more lives. I shook my head slowly. No. It protected yours. The room fell silent again. I never stole any money, he said. I know. I never accused your father. I know. But you knew he was innocent. His lips trembled. Yes. You knew people believed he was guilty. Yes. You knew what that did to him. He couldn't answer. He simply cried. And somehow, watching him cry didn't make me feel victorious. It made me mourn the life we could have had if he'd chosen honesty all those years ago. The greatest betrayal wasn't what happened to my father. It was realizing my husband had watched me grieve a lie for decades. He had held me after my father's funeral, listened as I wondered why such a good man had been treated so unfairly, comforted me, while knowing exactly why it had happened. A week later, I asked our children to come over. There was no birthday, no holiday, no celebration. Just our family sitting around the same dining table, where we'd shared countless meals over the years. This time it was my husband who spoke first. He didn't hide behind excuses. He didn't blame anyone else. He simply told them the truth. When he finished, no one said a word. Our daughter quietly wiped tears from her face. Our son stared at the floor for what felt like an eternity. Finally, our youngest grandson looked around the room and asked the same question he'd asked at the baby shower. Why is Grandpa sad? No one answered. Because there wasn't an answer a child could understand. Over the following months, Harold's notebook helped correct part of the story that had followed my father for so many years. People who had stayed silent finally admitted they had always doubted the accusations against him. His name couldn't be restored in his lifetime, but it was restored in ours. As for my husband, he never asked me to forgive him. I think he understood that forgiveness isn't something you request. It's something another person chooses, or doesn't. We still see each other. Family birthdays, holiday dinners. The grandchildren still run to hug him the moment he walks through the door. They don't know the full story. Maybe one day they will. Maybe they won't. What they do know is that Grandma and Grandpa live in different houses now. Sometimes, after everyone has gone home, we sit on opposite ends of the porch while the evening grows quiet. We don't argue. We don't talk much at all. There are simply long silences between us. Not angry silences. The kind that only exist when two people finally have nothing left to hide, but can never get back everything that was lost. And every time I think about that gold envelope, I realize something that never occurred to me on the day it arrived. It didn't destroy my marriage. The silence had been destroying it for 32 years. The envelope simply arrived on the day the truth finally caught up.